Okay, so I'm Martin Adams and I've come to Regents University London to talk to Mark Rayner, who's going to talk to me about research in existential therapy. So, hi Mark.
Hi Martin.
Just to lead us into the topic, let's start where we always start in existential work, with the personal. Can you tell me how you got interested in this area of work? I suppose I ask because existentialism has had until recently a rather uneasy relationship with research.
Yeah, certainly. My interest emerged, I suppose, working in the National Health Service in this country, and whilst occupying my position as an existential phenomenological psychotherapist there, I very much felt on the fringes of belonging, and I felt that the work that I and my colleagues, trainees, supervisees, were doing was valuable work, but needed to be documented in a more robust manner than the anecdotal evidence that we previously supplied. So,
which was like case studies?
Case studies and the masters and doctoral students' process reports, dissertations.
All things that were essentially done as a part of the marked academic content of the courses.
Yeah. Rather than, where it started for me, rather than saying actually existential phenomenological psychotherapy and counselling psychology belong in the NHS, and I felt quite passionate about my own belonging there and the need to evidence the idea that existential phenomenological psychotherapy was both efficacious and effective in that world.
Which presumably, as a practitioner in the NHS, you found that it was, or you suspected it was.
Yeah.
What you wanted to do was to find some way to actually show that it was, that you could talk to other professionals.
Indeed. Yeah, very much so.
Moving now into the professional arena, can you tell me, a bit of an overlap with the last one,
yeah,
how this ties into your identity as an existential therapist? Or what does being a researcher mean to you as an existential therapist? Do you see the two as being overlapping, or being wildly apart, or one and the same, or what?
I suppose I think that I try to adhere to some of the principles of existential and phenomenological philosophy when I work, but I apply those in a way that is driven at least in part by the context in which my work takes place.
The NHS.
Yeah. And in the last 15 or so years, that work can't really take place or continue to be funded unless we can demonstrate that it works effectively. And in the bigger world of research, the idea that something works means that it has to be measured. I do believe in qualitative research, in addressing what clients say as well as what therapists say, but I think that which gets funded or listened to mostly are numbers. I don't think we need to be scared of numbers, but numbers speak louder than words in the world that I live in. So going back to your original question, do they overlap? I think they are, what one might say, intertwined. Intertwined in a manner that reciprocally inform each other. That actually the numbers that we get may inform the manner in which we address clients' experience. And I think that existential phenomenology is well placed to address individual experience, and yet what I've attempted to do is to create, I suppose, what I would call an architecture of that way of working in which we can also collect data, numbers, measurable, robust evidence.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because we think of existential phenomenology as being about experience, qualitative, this kind of thing. You're talking about, as a researcher, the kind of almost a practical, funding-driven need to quantify, to measure. But also, I think you're saying you don't actually see a conflict between thinking of the work in that kind of robust, quantitative way and being existential. It's what could we say? Just another way of being existential, or put it around the other way, that there are ways of thinking quantitatively while also working existentially.
Well, for me, the fulcrum of it lies in the space in which a client comes to therapy. And for me, and this is only my opinion, people come to therapy because they want to get better, feel better, act better, be better. And the way that I've aligned that with what I've called an existential approach is that notion of change for a client isn't necessarily in the realm of change according to the dominant approaches in the field at the moment, which is changes in behaviour or reductions in harm or symptom cure or the eradication of psychopathology, but rather maybe in the realm of changes in understanding of self or others or the world. And I think that if we can measure the degree to which someone understands themselves, the others or the world, then we are not only embracing the idea that living is difficult, but we can also validly measure those changes.
And that there are ways that we can measure such things as well. It can
I
be
think
done.
so. I think so, and I think one of the keys, or rather one of the areas that has left many people who identify themselves as existential phenomenological psychotherapists out of this has been the idea that the scales don't match the experience. And I take a view that actually the questions that we ask the clients matter far less than the client's intentionality or intentions to answer the questions. If they answer the questions, they're demonstrating to me already that they're motivated and engaged with the therapy. And whilst that doesn't speak to existential phenomenology itself, that speaks to the notion of change that I was mentioning before, that if a person is prepared to answer those questions and engage with those scales, and we've joined in with the dominant scales measuring depression and anxiety, and of course as an existential phenomenological psychotherapist, we don't address the symptom of depression or anxiety as a thing, but rather we understand it as an expression of someone's current relationship to the world, to themselves or to others. And they express it in the dominant discourse that we currently use, which is the language of illness. So my work is very much starts around deconstructing that language in an attempt to then address the breadth of that experience and what something that someone says, I feel depressed, might mean to them. So I suppose it's quite meaning oriented, really.
I'd like to come back in a few minutes to talk to you about some actual research that you've done. But we talk in the book about using theory, using philosophy as a map that helps us to orientate ourselves in the field, rather than to tell us definitively about what to find. I wonder if there are any existential concepts and ideas that you have found of particular value when researching the efficacy of existential therapies. What sort of things do you kind of look for or try to measure, so to speak?
Yeah. There are certain principles that underpin the way that we approach clients, and one of those probably overlaps with a more if you would put it in a theory-laden manner, a more humanistic approach, but an approach where a human being is leaning towards their life with the intention of becoming, is always inevitably in a process of becoming, of leaning towards. And in the case of clients coming to therapy, it's becoming better at being whoever they are. Mm. So that's one of the principles. And we've also then spoken about a reciprocal intentionality on the part of the therapist who is inclined to offer that may be helpful to the client.
In future, in your project?
In the project. Yes. So the coming together is the coming together of two people, both of who are inclined to, are leaning towards what may take place in therapy that may be useful for the client. And we speak about that in terms of utilising measures like goal-related measures. So a client would be asked to identify what would you like to achieve out of being in therapy? How would you like to be at the end of therapy?
Now these things are usually things that we associate with the traditional short-term models of CBT, that clearly you don't find a problem you using them.
No, I don't find a problem using them. What we find is if we can ask clients to identify and scrutinise what they mean by expressing I feel depressed about, or I'm anxious, or I'm struggling with self-esteem, or the human experiences that people tend to approach the general practitioners for. I'm feeling miserable about, I've lost my partner, I've lost my job, something that may occur in the daily life of any one of us. What we find is if we, and our studies have shown this, if we address that experience at a relational level, they tend to express, whatever the scales are that we use, that they feel better because they've been engaged with in this sort of reciprocally intentional manner.
Yeah, we've been doing this together. You and me have been engaging with this together.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the clear difference for me when I've looked at it is, and this is not to demean any of the other approaches, but the theory-driven approaches, such as the dominant models that you mentioned, typically ask a client what the problem is, the thing that's wrong is, and then tell them how to fix it. And that's not what I would call a collaborative approach, it's what I would call compliance.
It's a kind of medical model.
Yeah, if you comply with this type of treatment, you will get better. What we talk about in terms of collaboration is, you tell me what's wrong, we will work out how you might address this. And that brings us on to I suppose, another key principle, which is the principle that recognises that all experience is potentially meaningful, even my stuckness. So whilst I might not want to be depressed and stay in bed and say that I can't get out of bed because I'm depressed, that perhaps we also need to recognise that any change to that, in terms of behavioural change to that, may put the person at greater risk in the sense of that we're asking them to move into an unfamiliar, unknown, uncertain position. So what existential phenomenological work does from in the manner that we approach it is try to address the tension between the safety of the unwanted position I find myself stuck in and the risk that I may have to face and the courage I may have to face the unknown and the unfamiliar.
This is awfully important, isn't it? Because being somebody is stuck because there's a payoff.
Yeah.
Even though they might complain about it, let's start with what is, and what is being stuck. So here we are. What's going on here?
And that, I suppose, if we were to put some theory to it, follows a rigorous phenomenological method to addressing what stuckness in a detailed, descriptive and clarificatory manner actually means to the client. You talked about payoff, we talk about the cost of being stuck and the gains of possibly staying the way that I am. But even within that, I might understand my position of stuckness. And if I can understand my position of stuckness without changing anything, that in itself is a change.
Because something is understood which was not previously understood.
And why can't we call understanding a valid and measurable form of change?
That's a good point. That moves me on to my next quick question, my next area. I wonder if you could very quickly outline how you went about doing some research in your setting.
Right, well, we've done research in both secondary care settings, which are in psychiatric facilities, and our current projects are aimed at primary care settings, partly because in the last 11 years since the inception of, or the conceptualization of the large government initiative, awareness of the entitlement to assistance in psychological services is far greater. So we have focused mainly in primary care settings, and what we believe is that the key way to reduce stigma associated with having a mental health concern is to provide the service at the GP's location rather than at a psychiatric or mental health facility. That also radically reduces the cost. It also radically reduces the time that you have to wait to receive the service. So if I was going for counselling to my GP and you were going for a flu jab, neither of us would know why we were sitting in the waiting room. And that radically addresses the issue of stigma. And stigma is still a very, very big problem. I mean, I could talk about it across a whole range of different cultures and stuff like that in London, but across all cultures and all backgrounds, the stigmatisation and the medicalisation of normal human psychological distress is still huge, and part of our work is an attempt to reduce the stigma of having a living difficulty.
Now, presumably, when you went about doing your research, trying to find out about the efficacy, you used some questionnaires or instruments to measure. Could you tell me a bit about them, how they worked for an existential therapist?
Yep. So, first of all, as I mentioned, we decided we'd join in. So we decided we'd use the General Anxiety Disorder Scale and the Personal Health Questionnaire Scale. The GAD-7 measures anxiety, the PHQ-9 measures depression. But the quality of engagement between therapists and clients was such that we added in one of the validated and accepted scales called the Core Goal Attainment Form, where a client is asked to subjectively describe what their difficulties are. And in that description, which is part of the assessment-driven intervention, the client is asked to get as close to the actual experience that they're describing as possible. So deconstructing the language of illness, deconstructing the language of disability, and thinking more about suffering and distress.
And experience.
Yeah, experience, yeah. And so we employed the routine outcome measures, the GAD-7, PHQ-9, simply so that we could compare ourselves to the dominant models, the RCT models, the CBT models of
and then you're able to compare across, so you can say, well, you say you do this, and
so do we.
So do we.
So do we. So we first of all started with this joining in approach, and then we added in this goal attainment form. And the goal attainment form is a very clever form, because first of all it asks someone to subjectively describe their difficulties 4 difficulties, and at the end of therapy it asks them to rate 1, 2, 3 or 4 the degree to which they achieved a solution or resolution to their difficulties. And on the back it asks them to describe helpful aspects of therapy and that which wasn't helpful. Yeah? So what you've got immediately on that form, on the front side of that form, is you've got, this is what my problem is, and this is the degree to which I achieved it, and that's a number.
You've got an enormous amount of data.
Yeah.
Out of it,
Yeah.
A massive amount of data from really quite a
Small sample size.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now we're going to have to draw to a close in a minute, but very briefly, what could you say about the effectiveness of existential therapy that you found from your solid research?
Well, if I set aside my passions for it and adopt a slightly more humble approach.
We know what you wanted to find.
If I set aside my passions for it and adopt an approach based upon humility, I would say we're as good as.
Right.
We're not better than or worse than. I believe, passionately, that we can be much better than many other approaches, because I believe that existential therapy addresses a breadth of experience that theory-laden models that are underpinned by academic ideas address a section of experience, but not necessarily the breadth of experience that we. So passionately, I believe we're much better, but humbly, I believe that actually our pilot studies have demonstrated we're as good as.
And presumably, I mean, if we think of the future, having done this research and found that these things with an idea that we could do better, we can always do better, you can then think, well, we could do better if there's more training here and more training there, more effectiveness, and it feeds back, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Research findings feed back into training.
Well, what I've learned from supervising these research projects, some of which, by the way, I couldn't have done. I needed doctoral students in counselling psychology who know a lot more than I do as a common garden psychotherapist about scales and tools. Is what I've learned is that the space and place of supervision informs the development of the model or of the approach. So I've learnt just as much from the people who've gone and done the clinical work as, I think I've learnt more about writing the model from the people doing the clinical work than they've learnt from me supervising them, just because I happen to know quote unquote, more than they might know when they go to do the clinical work. So I think that one of the most important things that's been, I think, neglected in the NHS is the naive approach of the trainee is a fantastic weapon. When I say weapon, it's a fantastic tool to be utilised.
Yeah.
That naivety to say, what's going on? That wonder at how can I help, and the desire to be helpful, I think is a fantastic. All these people have been fantastic people to have to help me to develop the work that we're doing, and we're going to roll it out as long as we can, I hope.
That's a good point to stop. Mark Rayner, thanks very much.
Thanks, Martin.
"24 minutes.
I saw us going on a bit.